Welcome to the Classical Gabfest, a weekly discussion about the ever-changing world of classical music. I'm your host for this week, Kensho Watanabe, and with me as always are Tiffany Liu and William White. This week, we'll be discussing the recent bankruptcy filing by Guitar Center, the US's largest retailer of musical instruments. Then we will dip back into our mailbag for another listener feedback segment. And finally, we will speak with Hazzan David F. Tilman about Jewish classical music in honor of the first night of Hanukkah. But first, we like to start with our prelude segment. So Tiffany, what are we playing today?
This week we'll be playing a round of everyone's favorite game, the game of pairs. All right, here's how this game is played. I've chosen two composers who share a similar musical style, and I'm going to play three selections that my co-hosts will listen to and try to guess who wrote each one of them. This week's composers are Franz Schubert and Robert Schumann. But before we get into the game, let's briefly discuss what makes these composers' styles similar and different. Now, I admit I chose these two composers not because I think that they're so similar that this game is going to be extremely difficult, but because I would have a lot of difficulty with this game. So I will first preface this by saying these are both German composers who wrote a lot of Lied, and they also wrote chamber music, and they also wrote piano music.
Let me just break down a little bit of what you just said, because the first thing that you mentioned there was that both of these composers wrote Lieder. Now, that is the German word for art song, and so that we are talking specifically about a solo voice and piano accompaniment. And frankly, that is probably the area where these two blend together the most for me. They're separated by about a half a generation. Schubert's born in 97, Schumann is born in 1810. But Schubert died early and was precocious. Schumann was a late bloomer. So there's more like a generation's worth of music separating them. So Schumann is much more a romantic composer. I think if we wanted to put it into listening phraseology, we could think of him as almost leaning more towards an impressionist sound rather than the straight cut lines of Schubert. So with Schumann, the sounds, the harmonies are going to be a little bit blurrier. They're going to be, not as based on like Mozart-style cadential formulas. If I can use a bit of jargon, I would say that with Schubert, you're going to hear a lot of cadential 6/4s. And some people will know what that means, and other people, it doesn't matter. But with Schumann, it's a much more romantic vocabulary in his piano writing and as well as his orchestration.
At the same time, I think that if we had to pick one composer that wrote melodies in a way that were really unforgettable, I would say it's more Schubert than Schumann. The other thing that I think about when I think of Schumann is, of course, he dabbled a little bit in music criticism and in a very unique way, right? So Schumann created these two characters, Florestan and Eusebius, to kind of critique different performances as different characters. And I think that really comes through in his music as well. There's, of course, he had some kind of mental illness, may have been diagnosed as bipolar disorder. So you kind of get these kind of
highs and lows, you might say.
Highs and lows, much more in the extremes than perhaps Schubert may. But also, I think that could also be misleading too, because I think Schubert, if I think about the Erlkönig, there's still that kind of storminess to that music that Schubert wrote that may kind of, trip us up a little bit in this game.
Well, without further ado, let's get into the music, shall we? Here's the first example.
I'm pretty confident about this, although I think it was a good testing ground because I could see it a little bit going either way. In fact, when you started to play, my opinion switched as we were listening to it.
Same here.
Okay. This will be so interesting if we had the same opinion switch. I started Schumann and went Schubert.
Oh, I went opposite.
Okay, well, I'll say why I did first. At the beginning, it had that moodiness and an almost Chopin-esque quality to the piano writing that sounded to me more like Schumann. But by the end, you had these clear interplay between the inner lines, like doody doody ding, doody doody ding, doody 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 dee, doody 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 ding, and so it gained a little bit more of that classical clarity that I would associate with Schubert. So what was your journey, Kensho?
Well, you just mentioned these rhythms that interplay, but even that first, that repeated rhythm that starts at the very beginning, that excerpt reminded me very much of Schubert in that way. I think similar to what you were just saying. But then when you were just talking about the kind of smearing of romanticism, I think harmonically, just some of those chords pushed me in the direction of Schumann. So it's interesting that we're talking about the same things, but we got pushed in the opposite directions.
This game is so good when the competitors disagree, actually, because this is so fascinating, right? It's a Schubert Piano Sonata number 8 in F sharp minor, and I would say if I had started this recording at the very top of the movement, both of you would have heard immediately, like, there's 3 bars of extremely clear introduction by way of those arpeggiating figures passing from one hand to another that gives it that distilled quality. All right, let's go on to our second example here.
Well, Kensho, last week you recommended the Dover Quartet's recording of the Schumann string quartets, and you said that it was some of your favorite chamber music. So is this a Schumann string quartet?
I don't recognize this, which is problematic.
My guess is I'm going to go with Schubert, actually. I just hear more of that classicism that we've been talking about.
Yeah, I was leaning Schubert with this one, not only because I don't recognize it as being Schumann, but also just the figures that were being passed around each instrument of the quartet too reminded me very much of something like the last movement of Death and the Maiden Quartet, which is probably the most well-known string quartet that Schubert wrote. So yeah, I'm going to say Schubert as well.
This is Robert Schumann's first string quartet.
I suck.
Opus 41.
No.
Oh no, Kensho is literally sliding off of his chair. We've lost him, listeners.
I will be down here in shame for the rest of the episode.
His hair is still poking up like a troll doll, just so everybody knows.
Okay, 1-0. Kensho, you can tie it up with this last excerpt here. So, excerpt number 3.
Es weiß und trägt es doch keiner, wie mir so wohl ist, so wohl. Ach, wüsste es nur einer, kein Mensch es sonst wissen soll. So still ist's nicht draußen im Schnee, so stumm und verschwiegen sind die Sterne nicht in der Höhe, als meine Gedanken sind. Ich wünscht, ich wär ein Vöglein und zöge.
Okay, so yeah, this is tricky because in these songs, they're small forms. So I think that there's 2 things that happen in some of these songs. One is that somebody like Schubert can use them as little mini experiments and kind of push certain boundaries, do things a little bit differently. Whereas if you're Robert Schumann, a little song doesn't have to be where you push the boundaries.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? A little song could just be something that's more straightforward that anybody can sing, that can sound more like something from the previous generation. So that is what I think makes these challenging. I think that this is Schubert. And now I have thought that every example that you have played is Schubert. I just noticed that the piano is following the melody of the voice, like it's sort of doubling it and playing along in rhythm. And I feel like with Schumann, the piano is often doing something a little bit more contrapuntally expressive, like it's sort of setting the mood more or painting the scene somehow.
There's also this like wonderful charm to the beginning of this that I associate more with Schubert. This kind of light, sung with a twinkle in the eye kind of character that I would think more is Schubert than Schumann. But again, I've lost confidence in anything I say right now, so
Okay, this is Schumann. This is from Liederkreis, Opus 39, and the title is Die Stille, which is silence. And, it's possible that, telling you guys the text of this piece might have nudged you one way. The first stanza of this is, "No one knows and no one can guess how happy I am, how happy. If only just one person knew. No one else ever should." The texts that Schumann tends to choose give me such a desperation about them, like a real desolation kind of feel. So even though this is fundamentally a happy song, the dissonance between inner and outer world is something that I hear, I think, in Schumann's life story and in his music often. Good stuff, guys. That just about does it for this week's Prelude segment. But before we wrap up, we'd like to remind our listeners that we do periodic listener-generated Name That Tune rounds, which you all heard us epically lose at last week. So if you'd like to hear more of that, we invite you to try and stump us. Check our show notes where you'll find a link to the form where you can upload a 30-second snippet of unidentified classical music for us to try to identify. And with that, we'll move on to our first topic. Will, what do you have for us?
In the late hours of Saturday, November 21st, Guitar Center, the U.S.'s largest retailer of musical instruments, filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in the Eastern District of Virginia. According to the New York Times, the company, which was struggling to compete against online rivals even before the pandemic, was hit hard when it was forced to temporarily close most of its stores earlier this year. Indeed, Guitar Center has followed a familiar trend in the retail world. Much like Barnes & Noble did with books, Guitar Center bought out its competitors in the fat years of the 80s and 90s, leading to a huge nationwide expansion of the chain. Its crowning glory is a 28,000 square foot flagship store in New York's Times Square, which features a guitar previously owned by Eric Clapton, purchased by the company at auction for nearly $1 million in 2004. Perhaps more pertinent to listeners of our podcast, Guitar Center is actually a huge conglomerate that owns several subsidiary brands, many of which deal in rental instruments for students in school music programs. Many of these stores also offer spaces for private music instruction and really do play an integral role in the musical ecosystem of communities across the country. And for that reason, this is something of a concerning development and something that we wanted to cover on the podcast. So just starting out, this is a financial restructuring of a very big corporate entity, right? So I think that we want to get more into what did these music stores mean to us and to our memories and recollections in our careers as musicians. So what does Guitar Center, what does that mean to you? Does it spark any images or recollections or meaning?
I've never been to a Guitar Center, but it does remind me of going to Sam Ash Music, which is kind of an East Coast maybe store. And then also thinking about all the time that I spent at Padelson's, which is a sheet music store in New York, where I think I bought so many of my early violin music, where, obviously those stores no longer exist now that we have Amazon and Sheet Music Plus and other online retailers of music. So it immediately brings to mind those stores that I really miss, being in physically to get all the things that I needed.
Yeah, I mean, I similarly don't have a particularly, I didn't start my violin playing life, taking lessons from one of these outlets. But what I do really feel is that a brick and mortar presence in an industry that deals with essentially the intangibles, right? We're talking about vibrations through the air. And also, but having a large corporate or at least a brick and mortar presence in a community matters to that community, right? If somebody who was trying to get into music playing without any family background at all walked into their school and saw somebody playing the trumpet and they decided that they wanted to get into it, where is the first place that they would go for lessons? It's probably a place like this. It's probably, maybe they don't have an orchestra that they can just walk up to, or, their aunt is a violin player. This is the physical representation of our community to the wider world.
Yeah, and you're actually describing me when you talk about that, somebody who came to music without a family connection. And my first viola was rented for me by my mother from Music and Arts, which I found out doing research for this segment is a subsidiary of Guitar Center. It was bought by them in, I think, 2005. Now, it's funny, I didn't realize, that Music and Arts is started out in Bethesda, Maryland, where I'm actually from. So I was going to one of the original ones. But then Guitar Center has actually rolled that out as a national brand as well. So, when you think about Guitar Center, I mean, when, I've been into Guitar Center a number of times because I'll go with a friend who's a music teacher who needs to buy a tambourine real quick or something like that. And you go in there and you just hear these, these dudes kind of playing with different wah-wah, bars or different pedal effects in the back. And it's way too loud and I just want to get out of there. But it is also the largest retailer of all musical instruments. They've totally dominated this field. So yeah, if you are a beginning band student and you need to rent that clarinet or that trumpet, your teacher's going to maybe send you to Guitar Center.
Well, and you're actually speaking to my primary branch of experience with these kinds of stores, which is that sometimes I need a last minute mute because I forgot mine. Where else am I going to get one? I mean, of course you can buy them online, but as I say, this kind of physical representation of the field where you can get the items necessary because we do need equipment. That's what this means to us. And so it's really, just to be able to look one up, and every community has a basic, my tiny little town here in the middle of Tennessee has a music store. And I've been there 3 times, since I moved here, which is a lot for me.
Just to give a little context, I mean, I'm sure that, Kensho, like you say about musicians geek out going into a sheet music store. For me, it was Performers Music in Chicago, which still exists. But then, there's also things like Tower Records, which used to exist. I mean, did you spend time in a Tower Records just poring over the CDs like I did when I was a kid?
Every week I was in Tower Records. And I'll have you know, there's still one in Japan. So if you ever find yourself there, go check out Tower Records. There's still one store left in Japan.
I mean, the internet obviously coughs up lots of browsing options. I mean, I go on these long exploring trips down YouTube rabbit holes just listening to music, or on Spotify, there's these playlists. Do you think that even though there's more music to be discovered now, do we lose something by not, having that experience of calmly going through every CD in a rack?
Yeah, non-algorithmically driven searches, that would be great. I think that was one of those things that I would just literally go through every aisle of Tower Records, the classical section or other sections, and just, sampling what they had, right? And that you just can't really do that online. You can't really recreate that.
Well, to speak specifically to the instrument world that Guitar Center and other stores do, there's a community aspect to which, if somebody goes in there trying to form a band, for instance, there's going to be a much easier kind of lubrication of that process via operations like this, because they'll have, of course, lists of people that have been taking their lessons, or people who say that, there's community bulletin boards in many of these stores. So as a community hub of amateur musicians, that's really important as well. Especially, in classical world, we're so intent on the fact that the first many years of your involvement in music need to be with a private tutor to the point where you can become conversant. This is not the case in most other genres of music. And so to have a place where people can go and practice, meet each other, and get lessons, and have a rehearsal space for a lot of these bands, that's also the live component of what these stores mean, and that you can't get online or find an algorithm.
I found it interesting too that in the article it said that Guitar Center had, up until February of this year, had posted 10 consecutive quarters of sales growth. So who knows if that's actually true, but it seems like it's from a court filing, so I do believe it. And so this idea that perhaps that they're being beaten by these online competitors is not necessarily the case. And it kind of speaks to what we were just saying about how important they are in terms of having a brick and mortar store like that in the community.
Right, and I think that the other thing that where these become important for our ecosystem is not only the chance for amateur musicians and student musicians to interact and to get, equipment that they might need, but it's also in the expertise of the store's staff, who tend to be professional musicians, who this is a great day job for them. And it's important to have at least some guides, like you're talking about, Tiffany, about, we need this private instruction early on, but you also need somebody, like if you're going to buy, to rent that first grade 4 band, clarinet, you need somebody to show you how to put that thing together, or say okay, don't open this thing until your teacher's there, or you need to get this kind of reed to go with it, or you need to get this kind of a mouthpiece, and when you inevitably break that clarinet, you need to be able to take it back, and some guy's going to say, okay, I just get out my screwdriver and I can actually just fix it with this one little flip of a switch. So I think that the one good thing about this story is that this is truly just a financial restructuring, as we know now. All reporting indicates that nobody is losing a job, that no stores are closing. So that is really good news. Guitar Center is owned by Bain Capital and Ares Management, just like two behemoths of pure capitalist evil.
Right, so it's not going anywhere. In fact, I'm curious about, I have a couple of friends who work at music and arts as teachers, and, my impression of a lot of the musical instrument landscape is that people want to play more now that they are I've gotten a couple of students this year because they're at home doing virtual school and just need something more to stimulate them. So I'm curious about what the now statistics of private lesson enrollment is, because I'm sure that all the stores and other central organizations that provide music lessons are pivoting very well to online learning. So yeah, kind of curious about what the life is now and what the statistics are about enrollment.
Yeah, I think that we wanted to cover this topic. We talk a lot about big fancy pants kind of stuff like the Metropolitan Opera, but in many small communities throughout North America, stores like Guitar Center and Music and Arts are a real hub. They are a source of expertise and important materials. So we wanted to kind of honor that and to honor the people who work at those places and make their careers teaching at those. For our listeners, if anybody out there is an employee or somebody who interacts a lot with stores like Guitar Center and Music and Arts and Woodwinds and Brasswinds from Indiana, which is also a subsidiary of Guitar Center, please write us, tell us what these places mean to you in your lives as musicians. We'd love to hear from you. And with that, we are on to our next topic. Tiffany, what do you have for us?
Okay, GabFest listeners, we so appreciate your listening to us, so now it's time for us to listen to you. We've received tons of great feedback from you, and we won't be able to get to absolutely everything, but rest assured we do see it all, and we'll respond to everything via email or social media, if not actually on the podcast. So we're going to read a couple of the great letters that have been sent in to us, and so let's start with you, Will.
All right, this first letter comes from a listener named Andy. He says, I'm really, really in love with the game of pairs the more I think about it. I remember going into that segment thinking, whatever, I don't know enough about music to get anything out of this. As the two of you point out details, I thought, wait, I do see what they're talking about. I can hear that detail they mentioned. Gold star, Andy, yeah. I appreciate when someone repeats the sound when talking about it. I can't scrub backwards to hear a piece again because I'm always multitasking when listening to a podcast, nor can I tell what rhythmic motivic repetition is unless somebody directly points it out. It really reduces the number of moments for me. As far as things to add, I think that some brief concluding reminders would help. I think I got 2 to 3 pieces of audience homework throughout the episode. I recalled none of them by the end since I was listening in piecemeal sections. Well, okay, so I'll just respond to that last little bit right there, saying that, if you ever want to know what your homework is or what you should be listening to, just go down into the show notes. Now, for those of you who use Spotify, I listen to these podcasts about podcasting, and all the people do on them is complain about Spotify and how it's like, the hyperlinks and stuff don't work properly. So sorry for those of you who listen on Spotify, but for the rest of you who listen on Apple Podcasts or Overcast or something like that, all of our information about an episode is in the show notes.
But also otherwise, like the homework basically consists of listen to the podcast and tell us what you think. That is all. That's basically all the homework that we're giving any of our listeners. It's nice to know. I think probably all of us has gotten feedback at some point that's like, don't sing on the air, don't sing from the stage when you're talking about a piece. Like, it's just kind of, and it's nice to know that that's appreciated by a certain level and type of listener, right? Because I enjoy doing those sorts of things, but it's always in the back of my mind when I'm just about to sing a motive. I was like, oh, is that really a good idea? I hate hearing my voice on
I think it's always recording. A good idea. I don't know who is telling you this advice not to sing stuff, but
it's
I always say to
in
sing.
The vein of a sort of like a public speaking kind of approach where it seems to, well, I mean, I don't agree. I think that singing is very useful, but it's always a little bit vulnerable. And so, just to know that that's appreciated is really quite nice. Okay, let's move on to our next piece of feedback. Kensho?
All right, so this comes from listener Kenneth. The program does indeed touch on many topics that are of interest to a person like me, from artistic management firms in the first episode to cultural appropriation. Whether, say, a white person can write music like George Gershwin did that was rooted in Black American music based on jazz idioms, spirituals, and music of understated rebellion. These discussions extend beyond the world of classical music to music in general, and even to food. There was a big issue about a Korean pop-up restaurant on Sansom Street this summer of offering non-authentic Korean food cooked by non-Koreans. Perhaps taken to an extreme, does that mean I shouldn't cook a Japanese, Korean, or other ethnic food because it is appropriating someone else's culture? Can only certain people play jazz? Do you need a set of experiences to play Indian music, Japanese music, Chinese music, German music? And I've never consistently read Lebrecht. I do follow Drew McManus's daily blogs, and I've listened to some of his video podcasts. I believe Kenneth is referring to Drew McManus's blog that's called Adaptistration. Is that right?
Yeah, Adaptistration. Yeah, I think that we can endorse Adaptistration. I also endorse never consistently reading Norman Lebrecht.
Yeah, and this question about or thought about cultural appropriation, we touched on this with Adam Neely's video on YouTube vlog, and also it touches on that wonderfully kind of disturbingly hilarious case of Keiko Yamada and educational band music.
Yeah, I mean, and so with Adam Neely, there was the video that we talked about, which was his idea about kind of a multicultural approach to music theory. And of course, that is always the danger, is that anytime you lean on multiculturalism, you're going to be accused of cultural appropriation. But he has another video that we can link in the show notes, which is about his experience of being a jazz musician, what it means to be someone who plays Black music, and how that has shaped his life and how he thinks about that. And I would encourage people to look at that. Keiko, I think about the Keiko Yamada thing all the time. And I always wonder, it's like, did this guy just have like a secret inner urge that like he needed to kind of cosplay as a young Japanese woman in order to like write the music of his soul? I'm still think about that all the time.
Well, let me come at it from the obverse, which is that, like, my name is Tiffany Liu, L-U, but, like, it would never occur to me that I would want to be a more authoritative interpreter of Chinese American music. I don't know what that is. I don't know what Chinese music is. That's just not something that's in my training or even in my cultural background. I really think that, of course I have probably more than the average person's amount of exposure to that, but I'm nowhere going to claim that I am any more authoritative an interpreter or if I compose music, a composer. And so, but if I did do those things, no one would question me if I did, which annoys me. I mean, I don't want to, it just speaks to the complexity of the issue. I mean, of course, Keiko Yamada was weird and curious, as the article says, right? But there are a lot of things going on in this issue of cultural appropriation Kensho, you must get this all the time as well. Like, you mentioned it as well, being like Japanese American, and where people will call you a Japanese American conductor, and that you just think of yourself as American, right? And I'm certainly in that same boat. So it's kind of strange to be put in a box from the outside in.
Right, and that sometimes these like associations are also even more nonsensical sometimes. Like, I feel like there's certainly sometimes as an Asian conductor that somehow I would be more inclined or better prepared or better suited to conduct like Ravel or Debussy, and like
right, something mechanical or something that's
even like lighter, or like, I don't know, something that is rooted in some kind of, I don't know, like it's just like, it's so abstract, the connections, yet I don't think that someone would be someone that is not as kind of woke or knowledgeable, I don't think someone like that wouldn't expect me or want me to conduct Germanic music or something just because I'm Asian and I'm not suited to do that, right? And no amount of years in Germany would let me do that, right? I think.
Yeah. All right, let's move on. Thanks for that very interesting, no doubt to be continued discussion, Kenneth. Our next piece of feedback comes from listener Michelle. She reports, "My husband and I absolutely love the Classical Gabfest. It really is fantastic, and I feel certain a major station will pick it up at some point. It's just so well done. I love hearing the three of you talk about the pieces, and we especially love playing the games. Here's an idea for a show. Viola jokes. Who started them? Get audience members to send in their favorites."
Who did start viola jokes?
I think, Will, haven't you just like issued a moratorium on viola jokes for this show?
No, I actually would like to do a viola joke segment. I think that sounds like a really fun idea for a segment.
Yeah, I agree.
That could even be a prelude segment,
And as a segue, we can even put in conductor jokes, which are even worse. What about this earlier idea that Michelle says about that she feels certain a major station will pick us up at some point? What do you guys think of that?
Well, I mean, that's very kind of her to say, that she thinks that we're of the quality that could go on terrestrial radio, but in a way that would be like a diminution of our ambitions. I mean, if we're on terrestrial radio, then only people who can hear that wavelength are going to get to hear it. But with a podcast, you reach people all over the world. So we're trying to take the world by storm here. But hopefully, with listeners like Michelle, we'll be able to accomplish that.
Next feedback. I believe that's you, Will.
All right, this one comes from a listener named Ellen, who happens to be a friend of mine. She says, and she happens to be a professor emerita of linguistics, so just a little background here. She says, "I have been pondering your comment on Classical Gabfest about how the initial short note stress in Hungarian music correlates with the language having initial stress. I am skeptical about whether one can find a general correlation between the stress system of a language and their typical folk meters." So I just want to pause here for a second, because we talked about this, gosh, what were we even talking about? It must have been one of our prelude games. And we were saying oh, well, if we're listening for Hungarian music, we always want to listen for da-da, 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 da. And we were all totally in agreement, right? I mean, haven't you guys always just heard that?
Well, it's almost like a truism at this point, right? Like that when people are talking about Bartók, they're going to talk about his language and how that particular rhythm is reflective of the Hungarian language. But I have to admit, having no understanding of Hungarian whatsoever, I've always just taken that on faith.
Well, Ellen has done some further research, and she says that she wants to find a testable hypothesis. And, maybe the idea is that a hypothesis could be that there's a higher than chance proportion of cultures whose languages have initial stress will also have the short accented first note phenomenon in their folk music. And she writes, "Do I believe that this is a useful pedagogical tool? Sure, since you tell me it is. Do I believe the hypothesis? I'm skeptical." So if we have any other linguists or linguophiles or experts out there who know anything about the connection between language and music, we'd love to hear from you.
Or even just any Hungarian speakers.
That's right.
All right. Let's move on. Kensho.
All right, so this next comment comes from listener Phil, and he writes, "What is one to make of what I take to be a fact, that when a ring performance takes place in Japan, it sells out immediately regardless of the price? How are we to suppose that Wagner speaks to Japanese? I mean the sort of mass audience that attends, not the Wagnerites in it. I have a hard time grasping how Germanic myth resonates in a culture to which it is, presumably, absolutely alien, culturally alien, if not humanly. But that's the question.
So this references back, I think, when a couple of things. I mean, we're in the middle of our Wagnerism book club, but then it also ties back to the segment that we did about music during COVID times in East Asia, and we were talking about the Vienna Philharmonic's tour to Japan. And Kensho, you were the one who was saying that, you know, these big touring orchestras always sell out in Japan. You know, we don't have like thousands of people going to attend a performance if like a Japanese theater company came to the United States. You know, that's not going to sell out the Metropolitan Opera House.
But let's talk about like the status of K-pop right now. Possibly it's one of the first truly, completely international phenomena to come to the United States and make it in a big way. And it is big, you know, it starts with kind of, I mean, if we want to dig back a couple of years, maybe it starts with about Gangnam Style, that era. And so we know that it's possible. And I will say for my part that my understanding of classical music in the sphere of China and possibly Japan, but mostly China, is that there's an incredible cachet that it carries that is mostly associative. And that's just, you can't separate cultural phenomena, those two strains of cultural phenomena, things that are inherently beautiful or inherently meaningful versus things that become meaningful by association. And in China, this matters a whole lot. I mean, the fact that you have an institution, the orchestra, that is supposed to be the representation of all that has been achieved by the greatest specimens of humanity, producing great masterworks that stand the test of time from the Western world, that means a lot in China. It does. And it means a lot in a strange kind of uneven way. For example, like if you look at the most popular composers, it doesn't really follow like exactly the shape that we've come to associate. So like, for example, you know, Brahms is not maybe the best. We're talking, you know, for there, it's like Chopin and Rachmaninoff. And then, yeah, Beethoven, sure, you know, maybe not like even quite as much as it is in Europe and here, but that's by sheer force of how much his name just dominates the landscape. And so it's by association and not necessarily by what's inherently embedded inside any of that music.
There is this also, regardless of what it is, it's not just classical music, at least in Japan, there like an absolute kind of being a student of something to the maximum effect is something that's really celebrated. So there are no like Cheesecake Factory like restaurants in Japan. You know what I mean? Where like there's 300 items on the menu, and everything is just as mediocre as the other dish that you just had. In Japan, it's like I just think about when I was in Matsumoto, which is in part of Nagano. I walked into a soba restaurant, and all they do is soba there, and so there's no need for a menu. It's like, this is what we do. This is what we do really, really well. And it's not just for Japanese things. In an equally, reputable restaurant in Matsumoto, which is a small town, I walked into an Italian restaurant, and it wasn't, these people that have never left the country cooking Italian food. It was someone that went or keeps going back to Italy every year to learn about the food, and I think every dish came with like a 15-minute lecture on what this was and where the ingredients came from and the history behind this dish and the tools used to be made back then. And so there is this kind of attitude already of knowing or becoming an expert on something. And I think this is something that lends itself really well to what we do as classical musicians.
Oh, very poetic parallel there. Let's move on to our final piece of feedback for today. This comes from listener Jerry, who says, I will be forever grateful to Kensho for introducing me to that pivotal work by Hindemith. Of course, I refer to the overture to the Flying Dutchman, a sight read by a bad spa orchestra at 7 a.m. by the well. I found myself transfixed as I watched a performance of this magnum opus on YouTube. Of course, it might also have been the wine that influenced my judgment. I have recently been reading about the lack of any of what we would consider good performance standards by those musicians of the late 1700s and early 1800s. Thus, I may have indeed witnessed a truly authentic period performance from that era, maybe. But I really think that it was the wine.
Jerry, that is the kindest thing that anybody will ever say about my trollish suggestion for our very first mixtape suggestion. But I think that one of the things that's really interesting, besides the fact that Jerry references alcohol being a major factor in his enjoying this twice in this comment,
Take note,
not
listeners.
just once. But I think it's interesting that Jerry's takeaway was that maybe this is a truly authentic period performance, from that era of this kind of piece.
I think we should come up with a classical Gabfest drinking game. Have any listeners, have any of you already done this? Like, what would be the like buzzwords?
See, every time Tiffany says milieu.
I was about to say the same thing. That was like the bingo word for Tiffany,
I've been
for
found.
Sure.
Yes, for sure.
I've been found.
And I guess the other thing that we should just say as a response to that letter is, that was Kensho's first ever mixtape recommendation, and you can find all of our mixtape recommendations in our classical mixtape playlist, which is continuously updated on YouTube, and you'll find that whole playlist link in the show notes.
All right. Thanks again to everyone who's written in. And please, listeners, if you have feedback for us, whether it's something we got right, something we got wrong, topic or guest suggestions, or anything else, please email them to us at classicalgabfest@gmail.com or find us on social media. And with that, we'll move on to our third topic. Kensho, what do you have for us?
If you are listening to us on the day that this episode is released, tonight is the first night of Hanukkah. In celebration of this, we wanted to devote a segment to exploring Jewish classical music, liturgical music, and composers. To guide us through this abundant landscape, we are honored to be joined by Hazzan David F. Tilman. Hazzan Tilman has earned degrees from Columbia College, the Miller Cantorial School of the Jewish Theological Seminary, and the Juilliard School, majoring in choral conducting. He is Hazzan Emeritus of Beth Shalom Congregation of Elkins Park, Pennsylvania, having retired in 2011 after 36 years of service. Since August 2011, Hazzan Tilman has been choral director of Shir Ki, the adult choir of Reformed Congregation Knesset Israel, in addition to serving as pastoral outreach professional. Since 2015, Hazzan Tilman has been a frequent guest lecturer at the Philadelphia Orchestra Pre-Concert Lecture Series, lending his expert knowledge of Leonard Bernstein's compositions and their connection to the Jewish faith. He has also served as creative consultant for the Bernstein Centennial exhibit mounted by the National Museum of American Jewish History. David, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for joining us. I want to launch off our discussion with a question that is just more kind of inquisitive, because what happens during this time, especially around Hanukkah, is those that are connected to the classical world only get to hear one piece, which is usually the Dreidel song. So further than the Dreidel song, I'm sure there's so much more repertoire that we want to discuss. What are some other important pieces of music that you're listening to during Hanukkah?
Okay, Kensho, again, I'm very honored to be here. And let me get right to your question. There is a Hanukkah hymn that captures the holiday. It's called in Hebrew Ma'oz Sur. Rock of Ages, let our song praise your saving power. The poem comes from the 13th century. It's a poem that describes God's intervention on behalf of the Jewish people who were persecuted by the Greeks in 165 BCE. And the melody is about 300 years old, comes from Germany in 3 or 4 different melodic sections, and it has become the signature tune, the signature, like the leitmotif of the Hanukkah season. Tell you, I have a recollection of one of our many trips in Israel. Must have been about 5 or 6 years ago. We were in Tel Aviv, during the Hanukkah season. And the Tel Aviv Symphony Orchestra, conducted at the time by Zubin Mehta, began their formal subscription concert during Hanukkah with that tune. The orchestra played at a sumptuous, gorgeous orchestration. The whole audience stood up and sang at the top of their lungs. And it is clearly identified amongst Jews of Ashkenazic or European descent as the signature phrase of the Hanukkah season.
David, can I jump in and ask a question right away here? Because I'm a church musician in addition to being an orchestral conductor and composer. And so, I come from this sort of more Anglican tradition of like Episcopalians and C of E kind of stuff. So when I listen to that, you said that the melody is 300 years old. I'm wondering about that setting, because it sounds to me it's set like a Lutheran hymn. And so can you talk a little bit about what the connections are between European Christian church music and Jewish temple music, and how did something that is this classic of Hanukkah get to sound like a Bach chorale almost?
Well, you're absolutely right. There's a very strong Germanic connection. The 19th century was the era of much cultural development on the part of the Jewish community musically. Before the beginning of the 19th century and what was called the Enlightenment, Jews did not even know how to write music. They didn't know how to notate music. They learned that as the walls, after the French Revolution, and the walls of the ghettos fell down. In 1810, I believe, is the date that is associated with the first organ ever in a reform, what was called a radical reform synagogue.
So prior to that date, had all temple music been purely vocal?
Yes, absolutely. Well, there's a religious dimension to your question. The ancient temples destroyed in the year 70 of the Common Era by the Romans for 600 years had a huge musical tradition. It had the Mishnah, the rabbinic text, describes a large orchestra, describes a large choir of men and boys, and it specifically describes how many men and boys for each holiday. Very elaborate music. Of course, we have no idea what it sounded like, but the description of the instrumental culture and the vocal culture is there. When the Romans destroyed the temple in the year 70 of the Common Era, music after that point, polyphonic music and instrumental music, was forbidden, was stricken from Jewish practice for a number of reasons. One, it was considered to be too festive, and we were supposed to be in a state of constant mourning for the loss of the temple. Two, as rabbinic law developed, there was a prohibition against using musical instruments on the Sabbath, because there are 36 degrees of forbidden work on the Jewish Sabbath. Fixing is one of those 36 degrees of forbidden work. If a string player, if the string breaks, to repair that string is considered to be forbidden work on the Jewish Sabbath. So there was to be no instrumental music from approximately year 70 of the Common Era, and that lasted through till the beginning of the 19th century. So polyphony in Jewish world surfaces and grows to be a rich culture in the 19th century.
And a quick follow-up to that just is so if the Jewish people had not gained music notation until much later on in history, how was music passed down through the eras? Was it just through rote, through ear?
Yes, absolutely. It was oral. It was absolutely oral. There is one element of Jewish musical tradition that revolves around the reading of the Torah. In the synagogue, there is a series of musical notes called tropes or neumes that go back to the 7th or 8th century. There are a series of 24 marks that there's kind of pre-notation.
Is this the same as what's found in Gregorian chant, the square notation?
It looks like it. The only thing, there are these marks, the commas, dots, spaces that are there, but there's nothing inherent about them, how they sounded. How they sounded was passed down orally. And it wasn't really until the beginning of the 19th century that notation became something that was part and parcel of Jewish life. There was actually a monk a monk whose name was Reichlin, a Roman Catholic monk who was a kind of an archetypal musicologist before there was musicology, who went into the synagogue in the 16th century and notated some stuff that he heard. But in terms of Jews knowing how to notate music, that's really a beginning in the 19th century.
I mean, one thing that I wanted to kind of get into a little bit is just that, I mentioned that I'm a church musician, and so, but I live in both worlds, shall we say, in the choral church music world and in the orchestral world. And there are so many great composers in the choral music world. Like I would think of somebody like Herbert Howells, who is this esteemed composer of English church music. Everybody likes to dissect, which settings of his Magnificat and Nunc Dimittis and everything like that. But people in the orchestral world, like Tiffany and Kensho here, they got no idea what that's all about. And why should they, So I'm just wondering, like, in terms of service music in synagogues and temples, are there any great composers that, like, the rest of us just know nothing about?
Yeah, there are. Again, going back to that mid-19th century flowering of the Enlightenment in amongst for the Jewish people, the most famous composer who surfaced at that time was a man whose name is Louis Lewandowski, who was chief choir director of the Berlin Gemeinde. He was recognized as a prodigy from a very early time, was a kind of a contemporary of Felix Mendelssohn. But Lewandowski was steered to write directly and almost exclusively for the synagogue service. And to this day, American synagogues will sing music by Lewandowski for very significant parts of the service. Again, I have a little sample to play for you. This is Lewandowski's setting of Psalm 150. That's Lewandowski. He's right. He has many other compositions that are much more gentle than that one, but it's certainly very wonderful and very typical of his role in the German Jewish community.
So you mentioned Mendelssohn, which obviously is a composer that we're familiar with, is within our kind of secular music canon. But he also was Jewish, and we know that he had some contemporaries. And I'm wondering, are there oral cues from these composers that a non-Jewish or even a non-religious person would be able to pick up on in any way? Because as you mentioned, all of these, what you've played for us so far has sounded fairly Germanic.
There are synagogue modes. Cantors are trained to improvise in and chant the service in that have certain moments like augmented seconds between the second degree of a scale and the third degree. Da, 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 da,
right, because certainly that's exactly what I associate most.
Now there are choral composers who wrote using those modal cues that one finds in the Jewish service as well. And there are choral pieces that are going to have those kind of oral, A-U-R-A-L, I guess, hooks that are immediately identifiable as coming from a European tradition. Some of those are particularly the Avo-Rabba mode, that augmented second Havanagila mode. Da 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 is a little more East European. We have to get to Bernstein here too. I must talk about Bernstein a little bit. I've been living with Bernstein for a long time. Bernstein, although not a particularly pious person to say the least, was his father and mother were Orthodox Jews. He grew up in a conservative synagogue in Boston. Mishkan Tefillah is the name of the synagogue, and was very much influenced by the organist and the cantor of his congregation where he grew up. And there are documented points. There are at least 20 places where music from Bernstein's early synagogue life percolated up into his compositions. He wrote certain pieces that were particularly for the Jewish people. He wrote a setting of Hashkivenu, a Friday night prayer that was commissioned by the Park Avenue Synagogue in 1946, I believe. It's a very difficult 6-minute piece. He wrote a setting of a Friday night hymn called Yigdal. He wrote an arrangement of an Israeli folk dance called Simchuna, and that now the Jewish musicians know about that, and the non-Jewish musicians probably don't know that about it all. Then there are places where his Jewish music comes up in his music in his own compositions that are almost humorous. In West Side Story, before any of the main characters in the prologue, where the jets come out, and in the prologue you hear the French horns go da da, boom. Well, that's a shofar call. That's the blowing of the shofar on the High Holy Days, and he has that phrase. He has in Candide. There's a piece called "I Am Easily Assimilated," and the original title of that piece is called "Old Lady's Jewish Tango." In his handwriting, in the score, that's the name of it, and then the tempo mark for that piece in his handwriting is Hasidicamente, meaning it should be done as a Hasidic tune, as a Hasidic, that's that in his tempo marking. So those kind of things, percolate up. The one I like to point to more than any other is a biblical reference at the end of the Mass, when the celebrant takes the chalice and smashes it down about 3/4 of the way in the Mass. And that the first time I saw that, and I saw that in 1972 on the stage of the Metropolitan Opera House in New York, it was clear to me that what that is Moses smashing the first set of the 10 Commandments. Of course, Jewish musicians love to point to the Chichester Psalms, which he wrote in 1965
for the 3-choir festival, right?
Yes, in the Chichester Abbey. Yeah. And he wrote that, and he was very meticulous that it should be sung only in Hebrew. Although he didn't write that piece for the Jewish community, Jews have the Jewish choirs for sure have adopted that piece, and everybody kind of makes their identity by presenting the Chichester Psalms. There are 2 versions of it. There's a version for 3/4 of an orchestra. The original orchestration has no woodwinds, and then Bernstein reorchestrated it for smaller and
for organ and percussion, right? Something like that.
Yes, yeah. Exactly. Organ, 1 percussion player, and harp. Kensho, I was incredibly tickled. The little bit that I know about your background, that you popped up with a reference to "I Have a Little Dreidel." "I Have a Little Dreidel" is brilliant. I mean, the fact that we're here in 2020, classical musicians talking semi-seriously about "I Have a Little Dreidel" talks about the brilliance of that piece. And the dreidel is a top. It's a game of chance that children play during Hanukkah. And in fact, that the song has survived. It was written, I think, in the 30s or the 40s, and that it has survived 70 years is incredibly powerful. And this is a version of "I Have a Little Dreidel," an arrangement a la Elvis.
Oh, I have a little dreidel. I made it out of clay, and when it's dry and ready,
well, David, there is no topping Elvis and the Dreidel song, so we just want to thank you so very much for joining us and taking us through this wonderful survey of amazing Jewish classical music. We have one other request: would you mind sticking around and recommending something for our listeners for our classical mixtape segment?
I would be thrilled. I'm here as long as you need me.
Thank you.
In our classical mixtape, we each recommend some music that has caught our ear this week to share with our listeners. So, David, what would you like to share?
Well, I would like to go back to the Chichester Psalms and just bring up the original recording. Conducted by the composer, by Leonard Bernstein, the chorus prepared by my conducting teacher, Abraham Kaplan, in 1965. The premier recording of the Chichester Psalms, recorded by the New York Philharmonic, what was then called the Camerata Singers, prepared by Abraham Kaplan and conducted by the composer, by Mr. Bernstein.
Okay, thank you so much, David. It's been a pleasure having you on the show. Tiffany, what do you have this week?
This week, I thought I would go violin and recommend Ravel's Tzigane. Now, of course, this is a pretty well-known violin showpiece. That is, his version of what I will, gently call gypsy music.
We might also call it Roma music.
Roma music. And so the more important thing is, which recording of it am I going to recommend today? And I think what I'm going to do is recommend Jeanette Neveu. She died at the age of 30 in a plane crash. She should have been one of the greats of the 20th century. She should have been right up there alongside Heifetz, Oistrakh, the golden age of violin playing. And this recording that I'm putting here is her with Charles Munck and the New York Philharmonic Orchestra in 1949, which is actually the year that she died. And, listening to recordings from this era, sometimes, you feel maybe it's hard to get past the recording quality. There is no difficulty doing that here. Her playing is so hot, like temperature hot in this recording.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Tiffany. Kensho, what do you have this week?
I'm bringing to our listeners a single from an upcoming album by violinist Tessa Lark. Disclaimer, I've worked with Tessa. I really enjoy her playing, and I would like to call us friends. And this is a piece by Edgar Meyer, who is a virtuoso bassist and a composer and a teacher as well. And he wrote a piece called Concert Duo for violin and bass. And this is the last movement, the finale. So I think Tessa grew up, and I think was born and grew up in Kentucky, so she's got a lot of bluegrass roots, and I think this album is full of not just her playing, but collaborating with bluegrass artists. I think she works with John Batiste as well in one of the tracks. Should be a really fun album. Check it out. It's coming out in spring of 2021.
Fantastic. Thank you, Kensho. Okay, well, my suggestion this week is actually, it's a leftover from last week's episode when we discussed the Grammy nominations. This is music by Shulamit Ron. It was nominated in the Best Classical Chamber category. Now, Shulamit was a professor at the University of Chicago, where my alma mater. And I never studied with her, but she was this kind of towering figure in the music department there. Now, I would say that I always respected her tremendously as a composer, but I never really got into her music. That has all changed with this piece that she was nominated for. It's her third string quartet performed by the Pacifica String Quartet on a new album. what I always love, in a new piece is that like it deals in an interesting way with the existing repertoire. So I think that this piece really deals with the Bartók quartets, the Shostakovich quartets, and the Schnicke quartets, which, are very meaningful to me. So that is my recommendation this week. You'll find the links to all of these and to our full classical mixtape playlist in the show notes.
And with that, it's time to wrap up this episode of the Classical Gabfest. I'm Kensho Watanabe, and on behalf of Tiffany Liu and William White, I'd like to thank you so much for listening and to encourage you to subscribe and rate us on Apple Podcasts. We'd also love your help spreading the word about the show on social media, where you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can reach us at classicalgabfest@gmail.com, and we'd love to hear from you. Until next time, happy listening, happy Hanukkah, and we'll be with you next week.